I discovered just how much living oral tradition there is, and just how much of that hasn't been written down at all anywhere, and how much of it, to the degree to which the people who engage in that don't even recognize it as oral tradition.
Yeah,
they don't even recognize that the fact that they know that a dragon lives under that hill is oral tradition, and that's part of the. That it's amazing, and that's partly because it is so instilled in us that there's this cut-off, this divide from the past, that we do not have continuity with it, that we aren't part of this continuum of history. Hello.
Welcome. This is Finding Folklore, the Deep Dives, episode
4. Episode 4.
This video is referring to the podcast. Episode 4 is the Urith Sacrifice.
If you haven't yet listened to the actual podcast episode itself, please do. This video will make a lot more sense if you've listened to the story that we're about to talk about. And in fact, if you haven't listened to any of the other episodes, please do listen to those also, and then watch all the other deep dives. What a treat you're in for.
And rate and review and comment and all of those things.
Hit the bell.
So I think we should get started.
Dive right in, as they say.
We can deep dive right in.
For anyone who doesn't know, the Finding Folklore podcast is a project whereby every episode we open with a new and traditional telling of an English folktale from somewhere in the breadth of the English tradition.
Researched and performed by Brice Stratford.
By myself. Very well, I might add. We then have a newly commissioned performance of a relevant English folk song that somehow intersects or links up with the story that you've just heard. Mm-hmm. And that's from a different performer or musician every episode. And generally speaking, we try to get performers who have some deeper relevance in and of themselves to the story and the tradition and the song itself. Mm-hmm. Then after that, we have about a 45-minute chat about everything that's just occurred in the podcast itself. I think we do a good introduction and we get a good sort of overall coverage.
We try and have some sort of sort of fairly natural flowing conversation in that, but keep it kind of reasonably light and have a few striking ideas.
We make a point of trying to be entertaining in that, and we don't waste any.
Just throw that aside.
Waste no time on entertainment here. No, this is just good, solid, dull facts and information for the real hardcore fans.
But with the Urith Sacrifice, one thing that we did, which we hadn't really done before, was we recorded the discussion immediately after the story recording. So that was, for me, it was still very fresh. Like I'd only heard the story in that form the first time, and then immediately
caught. Yeah. That's interesting. I quite liked that.
I felt a little bit kind of off guard when we tried to talk about it, because I think my thoughts hadn't quite kind of. I hadn't taken it all in at that point. It hadn't settled.
Have they settled now? Have you got any?
Some of them
great
have
epiphanies to share with us, James?
Well. There were a few. There's a lot of interesting little bits and pieces, and the way that it refers to some of the other stories in other episodes that we've done. Some of that we talked about in the podcast. Yeah. But I mean, one thing that sort of sprung to mind while I was editing it, that I kind of was interested in, was this figure of the father, which is mostly a figure that you introduced in your telling of the story.
Yeah.
Because it causes this really nice sort of transition in Urith from the world of her father to the world of her mother, of mothers. This I think I said a compound mother.
The mother. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I said that as well, but you talked over me when you were saying compound mother.
I'm sorry, I talked over you.
I think it's a really interesting one to pick up on. Yeah, as I said in the episode, the father is my introduction in a sort of shallow, literal sense, because in the stories that are told in the folk tradition and in the church version of it, you don't get this constant refrain of the father, but all the elements are there, and the father, as I've done him, is simply a kind of a personification of a lot of the themes that are there throughout. When I do a telling of these stories, I don't really feel like my introduction of the father figure was any kind of a change to what was already there. I felt that was very much, for me, when I read the stories, the plots, and I work out how I'm going to tell my story, it's almost like he already is there. He's just not told with it. For me, storytelling can be divided into the story and the telling of it. And the story is just the bare bones of the plot, or the motifs, the folktale motifs. We discussed the Stith Thompson folktale motif index in the Sprackjack deep dive. Yep. I think it was Sprackjack, was it?
It was Sprackjack. We
went to great length there. And that's those motifs, and in fact, the elements from the Arne Thompson folktale index itself, which works alongside it. So you can take essentially those punchy plot points and motifs, those things that you can boil it right down to if you're just quickly describing a story in a sentence. That, so far as I'm concerned, that is the story. Everything else is the telling of the story.
It's like you can kind of reskin it. In, I guess, video game terms. You kind of, there needs to be something to represent this new religion, and make sense for it to be apparent.
But also, and so I would reaffirm, so far as I'm concerned, all I was doing was telling the story that was already there.
Yes.
So it's this new religion thing. I didn't introduce that. Very much what we have, if we boil it right down to the basics of what's there in the Urith story that we've got a Christian girl with a Christian father.
Yeah.
She has no mother. She's young and she's beautiful and she is a virgin. They are surrounded by heathens. Her stepmother is a heathen and she is harmful to her. This is all happening during the harvest. There is some kind of a drought, some kind of difficulty with the harvest itself. The stepmother lures her away and gets a load of people who live there, so like the majority of the people are also heathen, and they use scythes to behead her in amongst the crops, and where her head lands, a spring comes forth. That's kind of the bare bones of what we've got. Now, so we have that. If we have the historical point that this happens, then that gives us more information about the story itself. So for this, the actual dating of Saint Urith is an interesting and contentious point. As I said in the podcast episode, Saint Urith is a really obscure saint, and there's very, very, very little that's known about her. So dating her is very difficult. One early commenter placed her as coming in the 1100s, and that there's various reasons that's just not possible. That couldn't be correct. No, partly because she comes in as part of a tradition of there's three saints of in the sort of southwest Devon, Dorset area who are very similar. There's Urith of Chittlehampton in Devon. Then we've got Saint Sidwell of Exeter, also in Devon. Now, Saint Sidwell, again, she gets beheaded by haymakers with scythes, and where her head lands, water springs forth. So very, very, very similar.
Seems like it might even be
pretty much the same, yeah. But interestingly, she's based around Exeter. We'll come back to that, rather than Chittlehampton. They're both very specific, but we'll come back to that. And then the third one is in Dorset. That's St. Juthwara, who, a slightly different story, in that when she is beheaded, it's because her stepmother has convinced her brother to do it. Because she's done some weird thing with like... So she's like she's for some reason or somehow convinced Juthwara to rub cheese on her nipples. And because Juthwara's got cheesy nipples,
Go on.
that is enough for the evil stepmother to be able to convince the brother that she's pregnant with some ne'er-do-well's child out of wedlock.
Oh, dear.
And so in order to save the family reputation and her own honour, the brother beheads her in a rage. And where her head lands, water springs up.
That's a lovely detail.
Yeah, the cheesy nipples. Yeah. I hope to include that story. If I get sequels to Anglo-Saxon myths commissioned, then Saints Sidwell and Juthwara will be included.
Okay. Cool.
So there's an incentive, folks.
So they're different enough stories that you would.
Oh yeah, totally.
Write them separately. Yeah.
Well, it's actually in some traditions, Juthwara and Sidwell are sisters, or somehow connected, and so I probably would connect those two. But Urith is never explicitly considered to be related to them. They're separate, and I like that. So it's easy to say, oh, well, look, they're clearly the same thing, so we won't include both. But what's more interesting than I find is say, okay, well, what are the differences?
Yeah, find those points.
There's obviously loads of similarities, but what are the points of differences? And then let's lean into those and present them together so that we can see why they both exist. Because the differences will give us the reason that both of those stories exist, rather than just merging into one. And something that's really nice in the Urith story is this, as you pointed out, there's this more female thing, this more maternal thing. Certainly this is an element of the folk tradition that comes later. You get the haymakers are female. It is women with scythes who behead her, rather than men with scythes who behead Saint Sidwell.
Right.
And that's... I haven't been able to trace where that starts, but it's relatively established in a lot of folk versions of it.
Yeah, so gives the story a really different,
totally different
vibe.
feel. Completely different. And so I think with that in mind, when I'm leaning into what makes Urith, and what makes Sidwell, one of the things that makes Urith is that feminine quality. And if that's what's going on there, then of course the way to help lean into that, the way to help emphasize that, is to have that in contradistinction to her father, who's the only male figure in the entire story, is her father.
Is it? So it's stated in the church story, the church origin, that Urith has no mother.
Yes,
because
a stepmother. Yeah,
well, of course, she has a stepmother.
And explicitly a heathen stepmother, which is interesting, which means that her father is the Christian one, and she is Christian, and her stepmother is a heathen. Yeah, which is interesting, and it's actually that is interesting because usually we do find a lot of evil stepmother stuff in saints' lives of a certain period, but we also find more often it's a Christian woman marries a pagan man and he converts for her. That's a very classic. That's a classic technique in conversion, certainly of all the royal houses throughout the Anglo-Saxon period. You very often see men converting in order to match with the religion of their wives. That's very complex. So it's interesting to have a Christian man marrying a heathen woman, especially when he already has such a devout daughter.
Yes.
You mentioned this. So, you were saying that
the
father is in the church version, you say?
Yes. The reason I was bringing that up is just the idea that that Urith's mother is dead from the beginning, like her actual mother. Because there's this very nice thing in the story that you told, where I think it's just at the end, it's talking about, she gave her life... she gave her blood back to her mother, who had given it for her. This kind of, we start to see really that cyclical, like life out of death. Yeah, and that the harvest, the kind of thing.
So again, it's set at heart. So this is all happening around the harvest times. That's obviously a key. That's a really significant element. The in the folk tradition. So I'll kick around this folk tradition, church tradition dichotomy. So let's talk a bit more about that.
Yeah.
As I mentioned in the podcast, the church version survives today in a rhyming Latin poem, which I think is currently in the archives of the Library of Trinity College, Cambridge. I think it's Trinity College, but it's actually from a commonplace. It's written in, I think, the back of a commonplace book from the 15th century at Glastonbury Abbey. So a Glastonbury.
What is a commonplace book?
A commonplace book is a wonderful thing. Basically, a commonplace book it's like a scrapbook, but instead of putting scraps in, you write things in it. So if you imagine a time before you could think of Pinterest, right? Right? The kids are into Pinterest. Think of Pinterest.
That's current, isn't it?
Zoomers love Pinterest.
So it's
So you think so?
medieval Pinterest.
Yeah, it's medieval Pinterest essentially. Not even commonplace books were around for a very, very long time. They're really cool things to have. Kind of like a visitor's book, kind of like a notebook, kind of like a diary, kind of like a scrapbook, all merged into one. You've got a little book. Whenever you hear a cool line or a quote, you write it down. If you come across a really beautiful poem, you write that down. A really interesting fact, you write that down. If a visitor's come to say, you might get them to write something in your commonplace book. And this particular commonplace book was added to sequentially over many years and generations by many different monks and other people at Glastonbury Abbey.
And so that poem is from one of those books?
That poem is definitely from the 15th century. Yeah. It's various internal dating clues. Yeah. So that's how we get the actual story of Urith in terms of that church version. Beyond that, as I say, she's incredibly obscure. She became, her cult became massively popular in the 1300s. I think it was, in the late 13 to early 1400s. Okay. Her cult starts to become very, very, very popular. There's no obvious explanation of this, but the theory is, this is theorized as being due to a massive uptick in miracles happening around her well and stuff. We don't know what those miracles are, but references we've got from the time tell us that there are so many of them that you could fill a whole book, a whole legend, just with the miracles of Saint Urith.
How cool!
People if we're just basing it on other similar saints, then probably they were to do with her well. Probably they were healing. These wells often cure blindness and fix eye problems. But it's a learned guess, but it's still just conjecture. Yeah. So there were loads and loads and loads of miracles that start happening around late 1300s, early 1400s. Her cult then begins to rise in popularity. So we get this poem is written as part of that. Her name starts to appear in various other surviving hymn books, things written down. This goes all the way through into the 1500s. And in the 1500s, really popular. She's really popular pretty much throughout the 1500s. Pilgrimages, obviously, when the Reformation comes, the pilgrimages stop happening in a meaningful sense. The church stops. So I think in the year that the local church in Chittlehampton, which is dedicated to Saint Urith, stopped being able to come and have donations given to the image of Saint Urith, I think their profits went down by like £50 in 1 year, which is a really big, that's a really large amount. That's a huge amount. So, but in spite of that, still very popular in amongst the people there, and we know this from the number of names the number of children who were named after Urith in the vicinity, in the area. It becomes a relatively popular name, and it's such a distinctive one. It's easy to trace that, and there has been some work done to trace out the way that all the Uriths across the country. They can kind of trace back to Devon. So that's really where the popularity of this name comes from. that's kind of the church version. There used to be an image of Urith in the church there that was obviously removed during the Reformation. It is theorized. People believe that her body is still in the church, in a little chapel in the church, under this medieval slab, which would be very cool. That would make, if that's true, that would make it one of the very few Anglican churches who retain their original saintly relic. There's a couple of those. I think there's a few. There's one that has. There's certainly one that has retained the relic because it was just overlooked, essentially.
Yep.
Somehow it was overlooked. There's another one. They recently found the relic had been walled up, and so it's now been taken out. There's a couple of others who've had the relic returned, that it was originally built around. And then there's Urith's, whereby I guess the relic of her corpse is overlooked because it's so ultra-local. This saint is such a specifically local thing. And it's hard to determine at what... So we don't know when Urith starts being venerated as a saint, when she starts being considered a saint. So the canonization process doesn't really come into being for the Catholic Church until... I think like the 9th century. Don't quote me on that. Like 9th century, maybe 10th century, but I think around the 9th century is when the canonization becomes a more formalized process. Prior to that, it's really it's much looser, and the folk saints and local cults, if they are strong and successful enough that the weight of public opinion essentially can canonize them. It's weird, and it's one of those things where if they kind of get past the line before things get formalized, then you're in, basically. And so through that, we end up with it. With that in mind, it's perfectly plausible that the church was not originally dedicated to Saint Urith, but that this girl Urith was buried there in the church. After her death, miracles start happening, and in death, it is realized that this girl who's buried in the church is actually a saint. And so the church is rededicated. So it goes like that. So she wouldn't necessarily, during the Reformation, it wouldn't perhaps have been thought of as a relic per se. I don't know. It's not my field. But
so the folk version of the story is going alongside.
So that's essentially all we have of the church version of the story. This Latin poem was translated in 1914. I read a small excerpt from it at the end of the episode, so that it can be used as a collect. And locally, within Chittlehampton, Urith is still observed. Nowhere else, right?
Did the well still exist?
The well still exists, yeah, very much.
Do we have?
Well,
is it dated as well? When the well is from?
Well,
or is it very difficult?
So it's very difficult. There was a previous. It's a very old well. There was a medieval sort of stonework surround to it, but that was done away with at some point in history, and a later generations just put like wooden for it to be used as just a bog standard well, essentially, rather than it being some glorious thing. So that well does exist. We can't date that, but it's certainly extremely old. That well existed well before.
You kind of have to believe in the miraculous death in order to say that the well dates from her death. Rather than cynics as we are, assuming that it was just a well and somehow got incorporated into the story.
Very plausible, very plausible. But also, you can just dig a well. So that's basically what we know of the church tradition, is that she's very, very, very holy, virginal, beautiful lady, and there are some nasty heathens, and her stepmother's one of them, and her stepmother, for whatever nefarious reason, decides to persuade all the other heathens to come along during harvest and reap her head off.
The harmful stepmother.
The harmful stepmother.
And she, in the story as you told it, she's
not harmful. She's a
beautiful one.
Beautiful lady.
Yeah, I think you characterized her really nicely, as she has this has a bit of kind of contrast and depth.
I was happy with that.
She's not your traditional evil stepmother.
I was very happy with that. We'll come back to it. So that's the church.
Yeah,
and she's very much part of the folk traditions. Then we've got the folk tradition, as I say, in Devon today. Urith is still current and relevant. But still obscure. It's not like everyone in the pub is telling you tales of Urith, but there are some people in the pub who are telling you tales of Urith.
Sure.
And there's obviously events that the church might do or whatever might do when it becomes appropriate to tell the children there who Urith was or whatever. Now, as a consequence, there's lots of, and this has of course been influenced by scholarship around who Urith was as well. So we've kind of got three strands really. There's the church version, there's the academic scholarship, and then there's the folk stuff. Now, the academic scholarship really bolsters that and is tried to work out. Interestingly, an early one of the early academics who was trying to engage with the Urith legend was M.R. James.
Really?
Friend of the show.
If you're watching
MR, leave a comment. MR James, Mr. James, as I call him. MR James, the great writer of ghost stories and the great teller of ghost stories, for that matter. He's the person who came up with her feast day date of being July the 8th. We now know that pretty much before he decided that, he made an educated guess based on the information he had. Later scholarship has demonstrated it looks like it was probably June 21st. But M.R. James's date is what's retained. So that's the observed one in the the church. It's remained as July 8th, which is fun and cool. And yeah, I like that element of it. In the folk story, if you talk to people and ask them about the Urith legend, there's a few really interesting factors. First off, there's this female element. It is women who with scythes who then behead her. Now, that's interesting because, of course, men would have been more likely to be working in the fields with scythes. It's not impossible that women weren't disbarred from it. It's just that work was more likely to have been being done by men. So that's interesting that it's become female. It's impossible to say when that happened, whether that's a genuine remembrance of, whether that's a remembrance of 1,000 years ago or 800 years ago or 500 or 300 or 100. It's impossible to say. I don't think it really matters, to be honest.
Gender of the executioners is not mentioned in the church text.
It is not, no. But the gender of the stepmother is, it is implied. Got to be careful. Got to be careful. The gender of the heathen women is specified in the folk tradition, as is this character, the stepmother, and that's interesting. I also heard just from literally talking to people in pubs, and as is my want, my general approach. This story, by the way, a very, very, very different version of the story appears in Anglo-Saxon myths, The Struggle of the Seven Kingdoms. And with all of my books on or of folk tales, myths and legends, I make a point of going to the relevant place and trying to find any living folklore and folk tale traditions I can from the oldest people there going down. So I prioritize anyone over 90, then anyone over 80, then anyone over 70, with the prerequisite, as in, again, the priority becomes that both sets of parents and grandparents were all from the area as well as them. And if obviously if I can't get anyone, then I'll go down further. But the aim is to get someone who's over 100 years old, who had both parents from there and all four grandparents are from there. I mean, that's the aim. Those are that's
the bullseye.
That's my key source. So speaking to old people in the area, I got a few versions of the story which are just essentially the church version, but I regularly got this detail of it being women beheading her. From some people, so often I had the wicked stepmother archetype. From some people, though, the stepmother wasn't wicked. She was something better. And the way that they made the stepmother not wicked so much was by emphasizing the desperation because of this drought. And by making her dad a little bit worse. It's like, so she's better by contrast.
Do these versions that you got by word of mouth, did some of them put in that kind of willingness for Urith? the kind of, because it does seem like a very saintly thing, is that she's choosing to kind of embrace this fate.
None of them. Well, weird. So when I say versions, I'm kind of. It's not like they're telling a 30-minute version of the story.
Yeah,
they literally just describe the
story.
They describe the story more than tell the story.
Yeah.
They describe the story and they give these points. Some of the people I spoke to, the younger people, especially when I say younger, I mean like people in their 70s or 60s rather than their 80s or 90s. Some of the younger people, they gave a slightly more like pro-pagan version of it, which is what led me in this direction. Yeah. They gave a slightly more pro-pagan version of it, whereby they recognize the objective fact that the beheading of Urith fixes the problem that everyone is in. And interestingly, what everybody did, what was true of all the versions, is that we like Urith. Urith is a good person. Urith is really good, and Urith is the one we go, hooray, Urith. Yeah. Like Chiddlehampton really does go, yay, Urith.
Yeah.
So the only way that you can have you can fit all those elements of the folk tradition together.
Yeah, because as soon as you pay attention to the famine at all, then you've got sympathy for the people, and
that unlocks it completely. Yeah. That unlocks it when there's a famine, and the pagans don't know what to do, so they sacrifice Urith. Yeah. And it works.
And it's fixed.
But at the same time, Urith is a goodie, so how do we make that happen? The only way that happens, the only way Urith is good as part of that is if, and this isn't a tragedy, the only way this is a positive outcome for all is if Urith actively gives herself over to it. If that's her, what she does that's so saintly, this self-sacrifice for the good of the community.
Yeah.
That's kind of... Those are the elements that are already there. It might sound like what I'm saying is just me making up a story, but that really isn't the way that I see it at all. That really is not. So in terms of my process, I do not see a distinction between those elements being there and then me expressing those elements in the way that I see fit.
Yeah.
So far as like those elements are there.
I find this very interesting. This sort of process of dealing with the material that's already there and kind of trying to find a good way of presenting it, or a kind of, I don't know, a way that feels like sort of authentic, but
I think so. Yeah,
a way that is using the elements.
The authentic is the word. I think a key thing that with all this stuff, as I say, I give great primacy to the folk tradition. A lot of people go in with this idea that there's no such thing as a folk tradition, that the folk traditions won't be alive anymore. There's no reason to go and actually talk to the people on the ground, that anything that would have been collected 100 years ago, and that anything around now doesn't count. Like even if it has been passed on and wasn't, which there's loads of examples of stuff still existing in there, and we've covered a lot of those just in the series thus far. People just don't engage with it like that. Now, so far as I'm concerned, especially with a saint that is so ultra local as this one, for me it's very important to give primacy to those elements which have organically developed in the folk tradition, and that they have to be united with the the textual tradition, the more literary edition that we have from the historical evidence and that we have from the church. All of that has to work together, and as I see it, those are all seeds, and the way they grow is the way they grow. But I don't consider the way that one expresses those as being a unique creation so much as a logical extension.
Well, it seems to me that much though I like your telling of the story, it's certainly not the only way you could tell this story.
Well, definitely. I mean, I've got two. I've already got two versions of the story.
Because those sort of saints' lives, so one of the things that this reminded me of, this story, is there's a Bergman film called The Virgin Spring, which is very dark, and it is just like terrible things happen to this girl, which then she's killed, and spoilers, sorry, and a spring pops up. It's fairly, it's a tale as old as time. But that thing with saints' lives, like they do often seem to be this kind of strangely sadomasochistic, like.
Oh yeah, I mean that's the deal, isn't it, with saints?
Yeah, thing of just excessive brutality to a person, which causes them to be a saint, and for miracles to happen because of it.
Although, I mean, obviously the brutality has to somehow stem from their being Christian. But yeah, generally that's the game. It's funny you say there's other ways to tell stories. Yeah, there's other ways to tell all the stories. So that's, again, this is really the distinction between story and telling. I could also have told that. So in the book, I tell that story in a completely different way. It's almost unrecognizably so, but the same elements are all there. Those key plot elements, the sentence descriptions that make up the description of that story is the same. That's true of all stories. You could tell that story without even mentioning the father. You could tell that story from the stepmother's perspective. You could tell that story from the perspective of the people who end up doing the reaping. You could be pro-Urith, you could be anti-Urith, you could be like, it's the same story though. That's the key. Yeah. It's the same story, and I think so long as you aren't betraying or intentionally inverting or introducing new elements, that's fine. This intentional inversion is an interesting one because, of course, I mean, one can say this is a pro-Christian story. It should be. And what I've done is make something that kind of isn't. It's kind of more on the side of the pagans, really. Yeah. So that's it. So, and I'm always going about how we shouldn't invert. And I've also taken a wicked stepmother and I've made her a positive character. That's also these are the very inversions which I have already on this podcast bemoaned and bewailed and said we shouldn't be doing these things.
Yes. Yeah.
But I'm a hypocrite, you see. No. So in this instance, those elements had already been established organically.
There's kind of precedent for them.
So it's not so. It being a saints thing, I feel like the important thing is not that the pagans are bad, it's that Urith is good. Yes. That's the focus. The focus is not... Yeah. I don't see that original story as being Christians good, pagans bad. I see it as Urith is good. Yes. And of course it's because Urith is the one who's the saint. It's not her father.
You're trying to find that seed of really what the story is at its core and serve that in the telling of it. And
here's the thing. If that is how I can unite the church tradition of the pagans being baddies and the folk, and one of the folk traditions, which is that the pagans are goodies, that becomes suddenly neither of those two things are in conflict with each other when you realize that the story is not about how good Christians are and bad pagans are, it's about how good Urith the character is. So in that sense, I do not, that is not an inversion. I'm also, the motivation in my telling the story is not, oh, bloody Christians, I'll show them. I'm going to make a story that's all about how bad Christians are. That's not the motivation behind it. My motivation is simply uniting the folk and the historic traditions and telling the story as it all is there. That's the motivation. Motivation does have a big part to play. And when it comes to the wicked stepmother, being a far more, being not so wicked. Yes. I suppose on that one, I could be more guilty of it. But again, that seemed to me as a part of it. It mentions that the stepmother is harmful to Urith, right? From the perspective of that. In the sense that the stepmother brings about Urith's eventual sacrifice. Now, that's a bad thing if you consider her sacrifice to be a bad thing. But if you don't consider that sacrifice to be a bad thing, then that isn't harmful. And what is generally considered harmful in that purely religious context is someone who is kind of going against the religious teachings. So really what that's just saying is that she is a heathen, she's not a Christian. And the version of the woman I gave was not a Christian. So I think in that sense that it was justified. I didn't interpret that as her being evil or wicked. I interpreted it as her being not a Christian. Yeah. Which she definitely isn't.
So to slightly play devil's advocate here, I don't
please do.
I think you've dealt with this quite nicely, but there's you could argue that this is being presented to our modern audience as quite a kind of an empowered and like female-centric story with extra agency given to the central character of Urith, which, I mean, I'm sure people will love that, but at the same time, it's not done out of a motivation to please them. It's done out of a motivation to serve the story.
And also
it connects the logic.
I mean, whilst it'd be much easier to sell it to people by saying that we've done this in power, that's the change, we've made it in power, or even, but I really don't see that it isn't that already.
Yeah.
In the original story, even if we're taking it at its absolute worst, we do have female empowerment. The only male in the story is actively disempowered. He's very passive. He's the father, and he doesn't power anything.
No.
The stepmother powers things, and Urith powers things, and then the people who actually come to the beheading, thanks to the folk tradition, they are also women. Even they are women.
Yeah.
Everyone in the story who is active is female, and that's not my introduction. I haven't brought that into being. The stepmother herself. Yes, it does say in the Latin thing, it says that she is harmful. But beyond that, the version I've given her, the version I've given here, kind of serves what happens, which is that the stepmother goes against her husband's wishes and clearly is more dominant and powerful than he is in the relationship because she is able then to take his daughter away and have her sacrificed or killed. So that demonstrates that is a powerful autonomous that is empowering, whether it's good or bad. You were
talking about the sort of outline of the story, which is kind of the brass tacks of the story. I guess.
Going back down to the bare bones, the plot bones.
Yeah, that's what there is.
That's what it is. And so far as I'm concerned, all that stuff is there. That it's not like I've taken a story. So we can contrast this with the story of Saint Sidwell, and again. Another element here with the stepmother is leaning into what makes Urith and Sidwell. Yeah. Sidwell's mother is not good. Certainly, Juthwara's mother, definitely evil. Like that's definitely bad. With her weird, wicked cheese boob trick. That's there's no good version like that. That's not a good thing, right? That isn't. There's no version of that is her in any way. Being like positive to Urith or like good. That's
a single way in which that's a good thing.
And so that's another important element here. In the Urith story, one of the differences that sets it apart from those others is that the stepmother can be this. And as when you're looking at these three, and I do intend, as I say, to put the other two stories in later volumes. So that distinction from those is important. It's important that in my tellings of it, those are the elements that I give primacy to. This is, I suppose, in a sense, talking about story and telling in this way will be unfamiliar to a lot of people. And so it might not be a way of looking at story that they've considered. And so it might not seem, a lot of people might not see any difference between just changing it and what I'm describing. But there really is a difference. There really is a key difference. And it's not just of motivation. It really is in terms of what's actually there. There's no inversion happening here. There's perhaps a more distinctive interpretation, but that is true of literally any and every storytelling ever in any context. So, I mean, let's think, are there any other folk elements here? We've got the... it's not very widespread, but there was this established folk negativizing of the father in order to help make the stepmother seem more positive by comparison. There was already this folk emphasis on this drought, on this poor harvest. There was a folk emphasis on women being the ones with the scythes who kill Urith, behead, sacrifice her. There was this folk element of because it's the Urith being really positive and her actions being positive and good, and which is where we get this self-sacrifice thing.
The sort of agency for her.
And there was also there's some sympathy for the pagan thing. Is that also so? Here's an element with the folk stuff, which again I mentioned in the episode, and which underpins one of the key reasons that this version of the story is so different to the one you've heard. I actually prefer the one you've heard to that one. The one you heard is more historically accurate too.
So what was it that actually changed in your telling from that book.
Well, as I say, the version that we've told is technically more historically accurate, but essentially, in this folk tradition, there are different. The pagans are different people and different versions of the story. Sometimes, weirdly, one of the more common that you get now is that the pagans in the story are Celtic. And I think this is for reasons that we discussed in the podcast. It's all rooted actually in prejudice, which is one of the reasons I don't like it. It's this idea that the Celtic fringe is more backward, and that Celtic people are more pagan and less Christian. And which is itself totally ahistorical. And as I won't go into it now, because we mentioned it in the podcast. It's a bad thing. It's rooted in prejudice. It's not good. And it's also completely nonsensical. The Celtic peoples in Britain and the British Isles were Christian for literally centuries, for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, almost half a millennium before the English were. Which is why it's daft. This idea that the pagans would be Celtic. When this story is happening, they've been Christian since the Roman conquest. They've been Christian for like 400 years when this is happening. This story. So
is it Anglo-Saxon pagans that are the incomers in this?
In the version we gave,
in the story
in the version we gave.
Yeah.
We talk about this thing. So this is set around the time. This is set at a relatively early point in Devon being a part of Wessex, right? So at a point when Devon has become part of Wessex, and the Anglo-Saxon settlers of Devon are at this point all pagan, and the Brythonic Celts, who were already in Devon,
living there,
all of them were Christian, had been Christian for a couple of hundred years.
So there's a sudden influx of pagans.
And that's what this is about. But because part of this instinctual, unquestioned prejudice makes English people the Christian ones, always, and non-English people the pagan ones, always. And even though today that's often people approach it whereby it's a bad thing that the English are Christians and it's a good thing that the non-English are pagan, that it's still ahistoric, and that is still rooted in an active prejudice whereby English people are saying that everyone who isn't English is backwards and stupid and pagan and ungodly. And we don't fix that by just saying, oh no, but it's actually good that they're all those things. We fix that by saying it's just not true, and it never was, and it was only ever a nonsense prejudice thing. But in this version, I retain the nonsense prejudice thing.
Right.
In this version, they are Celtic pagans, and it's an Anglo-Saxon incomer. You can buy a copy of the book if you want to know how that version of the story goes. There's also a version where they're Viking pagans. But that, again, it would be way too late for when this story could have happened. The only version of this that makes sense, that can make sense of both the historical sources and the folk sources, is if it is Anglo-Saxon pagans and Brythonic Devonian.
And was it just
Christians.
Looking at those sources and sort of putting two and two together that led you to that realization, or was there a particular discovery?
It was just looking at those sources and coming and that realization,
doing the maths essentially.
Essentially. And in terms of the it was just a realization. I had a lot more time and space in this version of the story to really talk at length. I only had a couple of pages for it in that version, and I simply prioritized the version that I'd come across most commonly, whereby they're Celtic in Celtic pagans in that. But
I mean, in that sense, history is only one of the sources. The folk tradition
precisely,
is powerful in itself.
Absolutely, and that doesn't undermine that. And in fact, it's almost clearly in the folk tradition, it isn't that relevant who the pagans are exactly. It doesn't really matter, clearly, because many are given. But as I say, in this one, I wanted to unite all the sources.
It is. So I think I mentioned in the podcast briefly that it feels like you've got this Saint's Life, but also this kind of folk horror, like almost 70s movie style thing. Like, because there are certain
folk horror 70s. Wouldn't that be? This would be a really cool. Maybe we should write it.
That's like one of the.
Maybe I should write it.
Yeah, I mean, we should definitely
we should make this.
Into that sort of stuff.
We should make this.
But there are these different versions of a folk horror sort of scenario. There's the kind of the Wicker Man, where you get the outsider coming into the pagan kind of dangerous scenario, but then the invading people being the scary ones.
See, that's a really interesting
style.
That's a really interesting element as well, which was touched on this in the story, but I think really digging into it in the story would have been too distracting from the story itself. So I've mentioned this stuff, but I've tried to make it so that it just kind of goes by. Mm-hmm. But that's a really interesting. We are so used to thinking of peoples and placement in terms of the settled people have the older gods, and the new people have bringing new gods and new ways. But in this context, the Devonians had a new religion which they'd had for a relatively short period of time, just a few centuries at this point. And it's an explicitly foreign one from the other. It all based on what happened on the other side of the world, brought by a totally foreign invading army, the Romans, and having no bearing on the locality. Whereas
the Romans also who didn't settle. Yeah, importantly, I don't know, maybe not importantly, but definitely it's an imported religion. And and I definitely have the feeling that it's not as connected to place.
When you say didn't settle, what do you mean by that?
I think we've spoken about this, maybe not on the podcast, but we've spoken about it privately, of that the idea that the Romans didn't intermarry.
A genetic imprint. Yeah, that's true. That they came, they were an occupying force rather than true settlers. They came, and when they stuck around for a few centuries and they left. Yeah.
That's where,
that is true. They didn't really.
Of course, they did settle while they were here. But,
but they didn't contribute to the modern ethnicity that is the English. Yeah, no, that's true. They didn't. It's really interesting to think of it in those terms, especially when you realise that then the Devonians and the Anglo-Saxons, and the Anglo-Saxons by this time have been in England for centuries. So Wessex has been around for I think a couple of 100 years around the time this is happening. So that is not some. These are all people who would have been born there, whose parents were born there, whose grandparents were born there.
Both sides, the Christians and the pagans are.
But the paganism is not only far older than this brand new Christianity, but at this point it has already been rooted to the country, and furthermore, the Germanic paganism of the Anglo-Saxons was a different branch of the same paganism that the Brythonic Celts would have been practicing. Both of them stem from Indo-European paganism. And yes, this would have been
potentially
different, separated by a few centuries.
They might both contain the story of Sheaf and Shield.
Well, potentially. Absolutely potentially. People don't know this, but the Celtic and the Germanic peoples are both Indo-European peoples. They both stem from the same people, and they are divided by a few centuries in terms of when they split off. But their beliefs all stem from the same older set of beliefs. So you get the same thing in a smaller way with the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings in terms of their paganism. Again, there's this split, and they develop in slightly different ways over that period. They're in different countries, and they're not in direct contact with each other for centuries, generations. So obviously they then develop in different ways, but they're still rooted in the same beliefs. So actually what the Anglo-Saxon pagans have is not only much, much, much older than the Christian religion, it's also a version of their traditional ancestral religion. It's a different version of the Brythonic Celts' ancestral tradition of religious thought as well. So they are, even though it's different to what they would believe, it's a variation on the same thing. A bit like, a Catholic and an Eastern Orthodox and an Anglican are all Christians. They have different, those forms of Christianity have diverged and developed in different paths and have different priorities and quibble about details, but they are all that's all Christianity.
There's a real kind of cultural commonality between them.
And it would have been similar for the Celtic Celtic paganism, and for Germanic heathenry would have had a similar relationship. So the new settlers are bringing back this ancient ancestral religion, which has been totally rejected by the Brythonic cults who were already there. That's an interesting, a total twist in dynamic, which is quite tricky, I think, to get our heads around, because we are so used to tying the idea of already being there. So you've got the older gods. Yeah, we're so used to that, which is actually how it's done in there. Yeah. I think because perhaps even then, I found it difficult to get my head out of that, just that trope.
It's a real habit of thought that it is like quite difficult to kind of think yourself out of it.
I think a good analogy for this is making it more about politics.
Okay.
Lots of immigrant communities will come to a country that's very progressive and have much more conservative politics. And they will bring much older, more traditional beliefs around marriage, for example, and what it's appropriate for women to wear. And so if you picture it in those terms, when the people who are from country X are very progressive and very liberal socially, they have, women can happily wear trousers, and everyone can drink and have lots of permissive coitus in all hours of the day, and everything's great, and you can smoke weed 'cause it's legal, everything's lovely. And part of that is then you're very open to immigration, and then a new nationality, a new ethnicity, a new people move to the same place, but what they bring with them is an older way of life, an older set of values. Yes, a more traditional set of values where women don't wear trousers, women don't dress in the same clothes as men, and you don't smoke weed on the streets or drink alcohol, and you don't have sex outside of marriage, perhaps.
Yes.
This is a thought experiment. There's no, I don't have a particular, this is a hypothetical set country and a hypothetical people, by the way. There's no coded message.
That all makes sense. But it's also interesting, again, to go back to the Wicker Man, that Edward Woodward going to that island, he's stuck in his ways. He's very prudish.
He's the prudish one.
And they're all
It's
very
even more
liberated.
interesting about that if you think about, a brilliant film. What's interesting, the first scene that was cut from it, actually, and I'm glad it was cut, but it shows that Edward Woodward is being made fun of on the mainland for being so prudish.
Yes,
for being a virgin. It's really good they got rid of that, because then it means that Edward Woodward in that context is just a freak in and of himself, rather than being representative
of what people are like
of
on
the
mainland.
mainstream of the mainland culture. That was, again, interesting. I think that probably stems from the general anti-Christian vibe that we get post-war, whereby, again, we have this Victorian idea of what Christianity is. Yes. And we say anything which is not recognizably a Victorian, puritanical form of Christianity must be liberated and free and pagan, which is a very knotted set of prejudices and fragments of different propagandas from various avenues and sources and times, all jumbled together. It's there have been one could argue that today there's lots of very liberated forms of Christianity, and in fact, a lot of the free there are plenty of free love movements from the 60s and 70s which had an explicitly Christian take on it. I think that Wicker Man approach is very much rooted in the post-war anti-establishment permissive society of Britain in particular. And you get similar things slightly later than the 70s in America, where it's an explicit reaction against the Christian right, which 30 plus years ago was a major player in politics. It's almost laughable to talk about the the Christian right now as being like this really important thing. But 20 years ago, it was a big talking point 20 years ago.
Can I ask you a little bit more about this way that you kind of research the story of like finding very old people and then going down,
finding the oldies,
because that seems like a really good way to kind of actively engage with with folk culture because you were saying that it seems like people think folk culture is done, it was all collected and now we don't do it anymore, but you can still go,
and you do, honestly. The more I research and the more books that I write, the more topics I cover, the more places I cover, the more I discover that there is loads. That there is loads. The New Forest book, this guy, the New Forest Myths and Folklore by Brice, Stratford. In that one, and of course I had an advantage there because I spent over a decade researching it and I'm from the area. Yeah. So people talk to me. In a way that they wouldn't necessarily if it was just some random person coming in. I discovered just how much living oral tradition there is and just how much of that hasn't been written down at all anywhere. And how much of it, to the degree to which the people who engage in that don't even recognize it as oral tradition. Yeah. They don't even recognize that the fact that they know that a dragon lives under that hill is oral tradition and that's part of it's amazing. And that's partly because it is so instilled in us that there's this cut-off, this divide from the past, that we do not have continuity with it, that we aren't part of this continuum of history. Yeah. That we aren't that folklore was collected and it's olden time stuff. Yeah. And it's nothing to do with us now. I feel it's a terrible crime that was committed when that
idea took root. I suppose.
I mean, I hesitate to. I don't want to use a nasty word. But it is a broken, antisocial, insipid worldview that comes explicitly from a particular type of academic who is incapable of engaging socially with people and with a community, and
it's
so
pushing detachment.
It is pushing. It's actively pushing detachment, and I don't think there's some conspiracy, and that was the point. I think much like there's some fascinating work.
You'll find no conspiracies here, YouTube,
unless that's a conspiracy. There's fascinating stuff to read about how modern architecture, modernism in architecture, the modernist style, stems so directly. A lot of the key originators of the design were explicitly shell-shocked and suffering from PTSD from the First World War, and also were quite heavily autistic. The entire process of that, and I mean, I won't go into too much detail on that. It's fascinating. Give it a Google. You'll be able to find this. I can't think of who's written these studies off the top of my head, but the autism and the PTSD that was that really heavily defined the people who were so many of the people behind these designs actively informs and defines the designs themselves. Yes, and ends up, and this is the reason that a lot of architecture makes a lot of people aren't able to engage with it in the same way. There's no shortage of studies of the way that people respond to react to a more traditionally designed house. It's totally the places that your eyes go to, the things you recognize. You respond to it almost as if it's a human. You recognize patterns there, which you can't and don't with modernist architecture. It's one of the reasons that brutalism can be so intimidating, overwhelming, dispiriting. Again, this is not to say there are not some beautiful examples of brutalist architecture or of other forms of modern architecture. I'm not really speaking them about as purely in terms of the aesthetics. I'm speaking about them as a habitat that is created. I think that we have a similar thing whereby it was not the agenda or the active intention of those people to revolutionize aesthetics and to create an explicitly autistic or traumatized version of society that would become the standard internationally. That wasn't the intention, but that is what happened. And it happened because the people who were behind that were defined by these things, and that which people weren't really so much aware of. Essentially, I think the same thing has happened culturally with another generation of academics who were utterly cut off from any kind of community roots, who didn't and don't feel any particular human warmth, have any particular understanding of human community. They're people who think that their crutches are actually strengths that make them better than everyone around them. And there's this horrible twist of insecurities turned into identifiers, into badges, and sources of pride.
If we're trying to right these wrongs and discover a new way of engaging, can you give me some pointers on
yeah, I can. I think just the pointer is, I mean, so I say this a lot, and in fact, in the next book, Halloween Folklore and Ghost Stories, I highlight a few examples of academic practice actively disrupting and potentially even overwhelming and destroying the living folk culture through unnecessary and arrogant intervention. The way to do it is, if you want to do some folk stuff, don't say, okay, I'll apply to the Arts Council. Don't go to a university. Don't find an academic who's an authority in it. Go to a place and talk to old people. Talk to people who are doing it. Go to the church. Go to the pub. Go to the community groups who are doing things. Connect with people, make it a human thing first and foremost, rather than an intellectual thing first and foremost. Don't make it about you. Don't make it about the self either. That's another major thing. So much of this stuff, and this comes across in the story, I think, this self-worship, this individualism, folk stories, folk music, folk culture is defined by folk. It's defined by this communitarian thing. It is this lovely infinity where every teller is another link in this infinite chain, and all of those links need to be there. You can't just replace that with a single link. You can't make it about one link. You can't make it all about you. And I think that this is true of both academia and I think the arts today in general. There's such self-worship, and people can't see beyond the self. And people have I think people now very often taught that the way to make art, whether it's stand-up comedy or whether it's writing a book or making a comic or writing a dissertation about one of those things, I think the line between the creation of art and the commentary on art has become incredibly blurred, to the extent that most people who think they're artists aren't. They're academics or critics. Who can't make good art, but they think they can because they get given awards and they get told and they know all the right people. And they're part of the machine. You heard it here, folks. Yeah. No conspiracy. What was I saying? What was my point? I just got lost in this diatribe.
Well, I kind of want to slightly get you...
Oh, yeah, so I was saying what the... we will go back.
No, that's right.
I'll finish this.
Yeah.
No, it's gone.
Because
they're bad. Be folk. Don't be individual.
But more specifically, do you like write to people if you're researching something in Devon?
I see. Well,
how do you find these people?
I'll tell you. Obviously you do go down to Devon at some point, but also you contact parish councils, you contact church groups, you contact women's institutes, you contact Rotary clubs, you contact probers clubs, you contact U3A, University of the Third Age, any historical societies, any mummers groups, any Morris dancers, any May group, all of the, you email. It's never been easy. You also join the local Facebook page for this area. You sign up and you post a question on there, and then you get loads of people responding. You also you and that's just the main local page. You also that with smaller pages relevant to that area. Once you've done all that and you've waited and you've gotten a lot of stuff, you end up eventually going down and visiting the place.
Yeah,
it's also good to get in touch with pubs themselves, get set up with locals, good regulars, and old folks' homes too. A good way of getting to... Another thing you do is...
It's obvious now that you've told me.
You look in local papers and you see birthdays of people who are very old. They're usually put there, and then you can bit of old-fashioned sleuthing, you can get people's contact details. Phone books still exist.
It's interesting because like my kind of assumption was, these older people are not going to be, they're going to be staying inside their houses. They won't be hanging out telling stories at the pub anymore if they're over 100 years old. But
yeah, the really old ones tend not to be doing that. But they do, you'd be amazed at how active people are.
You're talking about people who are engaged in folk culture. Mm-hmm. So they are likely to be part of these groups. I suppose the ones that you're looking for are the ones who would be out doing Morris dancing or doing Rotary Club or whatever. Or
they're known of. This is another thing, generally, when people are very old like that, if they're living in a village, people know, because people look out for and keep an eye on old people. Different in a major city where people are far more anonymized.
Yeah.
But in every village, you will be able to find people who know of all the people who are over 100. It's easy to find all the people over 100 in the village.
There's the befriending can't say it, befriending groups. My mum does this thing of like, she goes and like visits old people, and like if they need
how old's your mum?
My mum's older than most of them. It's funny. She definitely does. She takes care of people who are significantly younger than she is.
Well, why break the habit of a lifetime? Yeah, this is. I really love approaching that. I got the whole parents and grandparents all from the same place is something I read about years ago. There was some early genetic study of the British population, maybe 20 years ago, I think. Maybe 20 years ago. That's a total guess based on my vague feeling, so that might not be in any way accurate. But I feel like it was around then that I read about it. This is some time ago, where that was one of the provisos. The way they decided, okay, this represents someone from Devon, this represents someone from Cornwall, this represents someone from Lancashire, would be someone who's both generations, both parents and all four grandparents were from that one place. The reason behind that is that dates all of the people who you descend from prior to the Second World War to a single area. And there was obviously considerably less domestic movement and international movement. Displacement. Prior to the Second World War. And actually, I think at that point, it probably got you to around the First World War, but when these tests were done. And by the way I do it, by explicitly preferring the oldest possible people, that then moves it back even further. So if I luck out and I find someone who's 100 years old, and their parents were, so they have already been in this place for 100 years. And then if we move that back to when their parents were born, that makes it about 130. And then when their grandparents were born on all sides, that takes it back to another 30 years. So that means you can then get back at least 160 years in one place. So immediately already you're talking about like what, the 1850s, the 1860s. You're in the 1860s now. And that's when people were writing things down. No, I mean, it's that easy to suddenly get back and have a story from the 1860s. We're that close to past. And that's that's if you're being conservative. Everyone more or less, right, barring exceptions, can confidently tell a story that their grandfather or grandmother told them. They can very confidently say, "Oh yeah, my grandparents told me this story. This is a thing that they definitely did." You can also, sometimes at a push, you can make it a great grandparent. Rarer to go great, but not impossible. I mean, so if you do go great, then you're getting us now to like 190. We're getting nearer. We're nearly at 2 centuries if you go a bit more tenuous with it, a bit more of a reach. We're that close to the past. We're that close to being able to say, in the mid 19th century, this was a tradition. Still, just from talking to people, we can still reach that far back in the history just from living memory. Which is amazing because people don't think like that. And the easy way to get completely insane about this stuff is when you realize every time someone dies, you've lost everything. Everything that hasn't been written down, you've lost it. There are people I've spoken to who died the year after, and if I hadn't spoken to them then, I would have lost it. I wouldn't have gotten what I got from them. And there is no shortage of that. And Oh, it kills me, because obviously the oldest people are the most valuable resource in terms of going really far back.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, ideally you want people born before the Second World War. That's really nice. You get to really go back that bit further. I think that another element of this, because obviously this getting someone around 100 years old whose parents and all grandparents are all from one place, this source of folk knowledge is especially valuable when we're talking about someone like Urith, who is so localized, so specific. I mean, I think even at her height, even at the height of Urith's fame and notoriety in the 15th in the 16th century, she was still only known in like North Devon and North Somerset. Mm-hmm. Like that's just it didn't spread. Certainly, it spread no further east than Glastonbury, and people in Cornwall were unaware. Commentators and experts in these fields in Cornwall of the time didn't know who Urith
Never
was.
heard of her.
Yeah, so literally with just talking
Urith?
Dorset and Somerset. Yeah, Urith. Later versions call her Hyreth or Herith. But that's much later, and that just comes from cod Latinizations and cod Grecanizations. What would be the?
Oh, there's
what's the word? There's definitely a word.
I think it's it'd be a different
Hellenization.
Yeah,
I don't know. Hellenization is something like that. Yeah. Well, regardless, it's that. So it's the pre-Reformation name is Urith. That's the proper name. Mm-hmm. There is a cognate in the name itself is presumably Brythonic Celtic, and there's a cognate in Irish, which is my Irish pronunciation is off, but I think it's Iwerdd, Iwerdd. I think that's a hard double D is. I think that's pronounced Iwerdd. Iwerdd, I believe. If my Duolingo Welsh is is having an effect. This localized thing is really important when you have someone like Urith, and I find that really fascinating. One of the reasons I've included her in this volume and in this podcast is because of that ultra localized thing. Yeah, in terms of this notion of continuity of folk culture, there's loads of saints who have been completely forgotten.
Yeah.
What I find really exciting is a saint that's forgotten everywhere except one place. Mm-hmm. And in that one place, they are still remembered. They're still kept alive. Mm-hmm. That is the continuity. Those are the ones that I'm very interested in, then expanding to a wider national, international audience. Mm-hmm. Because that has that continuity. It means something more when that torch has been kept burning.
I mean, this is almost is the same kind of idea as a more extreme version of what we were talking about with Rufus, the Red King.
Yeah, it is. It is.
People inside the forest
it's
know
absolutely
the story.
That. Yeah, it's absolutely
outside.
That. And that's what I'm most interested by, because certainly in England, folk culture survives in a regional sense, and I'm desperate to find all these fires and then kindle them and stoke them and expand them and spread them while they are still alight, while these small flames are still alight. Yeah, I want to light the beacons.
So the thing about them being super local, it kind of means that they're going to be idiosyncratic. They're going to be very much their own thing. Yeah. We talked last episode when we were talking about of Sheaf and Shield about this idea of the way that people seem to want to patch one folklore using a different folklore from a completely different branch, and that to me, like the idea there seems to be homogenizing.
Yes, it ends up
just making all of it the same.
It does. There's this homogenizing impulse.
But if you go for the super local, you get the...
It's the opposite.
The weird.
It's actually the opposite of homogenizing, because you're emphasizing the distinctions. Instead of making everything nationally the same, you're exploring all the lovely specificity. Yeah. And the local element is not the only element in terms of my choosing this. I like that, but I also... There are certain themes within these saints' lives which I've chosen. The pagans being an explicit character is interesting.
Yeah.
So the head coming off and making a spring is interesting. Also, when I really like, with Urith especially, her body still being in the church, the idea that it's the well still being there.
Yeah.
There being still physical and architectural conduits to the story is very important. I think that's something that I really wanted then to help bring out and expand. I want people to be able to go to Chittlehampton, go to Devon, and actually physically engage with the story. You can go to the church and you can place a hand on Urith's tomb. You can go and get water from her well and wash your face with it. That's
cure your
powerful.
blindness.
Yeah, you can cure your blindness.
Get rid of your cataracts.
You can burn it away. I think that's really powerful.
Physical trace of the story.
A conduit into not just the past, but into story, into mythology.
Yeah.
I think that so this cluster of things were my motivation, including this particular saint's life and other saints' lives in the stories. I think often saints' lives in general are a really undervalued and underused resource in terms of exploring and finding folk lore, folk tales. They're disregarded because they're Christian for the most part, and people forget that this is it's a local thing. It's whichever church has its flag waving over it is irrelevant. It's from this place. It's from these people.
Yeah, I was just thinking it has the same qualities that we were talking about in the fairy stories of it's like I was making a mistake earlier of like thinking, of course the well will date from the time of her death because that was when it sprung up. But you don't kind of necessarily believe you don't believe in fairies, but you kind of
it's a lived
as if you do.
It's a lived experience, not an epistemological proposition, which is doubly ironic when we're talking about a saint not being an epistemological proposition.
Yeah,
but it's true. This is a lived reality, an experiential form of belief, which is so important and so fascinating and enriches life.
There's something to do with the fact that the bones are actually there.
Bones
that reinforces that.
It's really, I mean, relics are powerful things. Like, I don't care what anyone says. I don't care what
you were talking
says.
about reliquary.
Yes, I was.
Possibly the last.
I think it was the last
video?
one. Yeah, I think it was. Whatever.
But anyway,
something to do with the previous episode. I was talking about the reliquary.
And yes, they are endowed with kind of, I don't know, some kind of importance.
And it's not religious. It is. It's bigger than that, grander than that. People go to see Shakespeare's grave, and they will sit there and contemplate his bones there, and regardless of what religion they are, regardless of whether they have a religion, there is something powerful about the remnants of a life, of a death.
The traces of the past.
Conduits into the past, conduits into history, conduits into mythology, conduits into legend. I think these things elevate us as individuals. They both, as a conduit to history, they can elevate us beyond just our mortal span. And by elevating us into mythology, into legend, into folktale like this, they expand us beyond the bounds of the natural world. So we become enchanted. We become rewilded with enchantment, with magic. We're bigger than that. And that's what we need to be. That's what we must be. Otherwise, all we have is misery and mortgages and witherings of age and just a bleak office job existence. That's no way to live, James. It's no way to live.
Oh God, you're right. What am I doing with my life?
Well, you're certainly not working in an office job.
No, it's true, I'm not. It's all good stuff.
It's all good stuff. Let's see. What
do we have anything else we want to?
Well, let's see. If we go sequentially through the story.
Yeah.
We start with the birth of a baby girl. We've spoken about that in the podcast episode about how that's nice because that contrasts with the previous episode. We start with a baby boy. We talk about the father. We discussed the father character. We've spoken about him nicely. We've got the birth mother.
Yes, I mean, well, before that, you've got no, not before the birth mother, but you along with that section, you have the pagans living alongside this Christian father. Another thing that I thought was quite kind of like an interesting element to the story is the way that, as with Red King, you kind of stripped it of specifics.
Yes,
particularly in terms of the religions.
Yeah.
But the signs are all there. There's the one true God, and
also I think with and I did the same with Sheaf and Shield as well. I remove these because I think that in the context that we're I'm sure I've said this, but I think in the context that we're giving these stories, those specifics aren't helpful and they alienate. If I was telling the story in Chittlehampton, then obviously it would be riddled. It would
local...
be covered in specifics. But that's about audience context. And again, this is the difference between the telling and the story. Different tellings of the same story aren't different stories. They're just different tellings of it. It's funny, earlier you said, you can almost do you could tell this a different way. Of course you could. You can tell every story in infinity of ways and should.
Yeah.
And in fact, there should be a different telling of the story for every single person who hears the story. That's how broad, and I would take it even further and say there should be a different telling for every time every single person hears that story told. Because you're a different person and you're hearing it in a different context. What you hear on a wet Wednesday will be very different to what you hear on a sunny Thursday, even if it's the exact same thing.
Yeah.
You're bringing a totally different lens to the interpretation and experience of that story, even when the story itself is what you're getting is identical. You are taking it completely differently.
Yeah.
And that's true not just of the audience, but also of the teller of the tale, the storyteller themselves. They can't just mimic and repeat the same thing that worked once, because even if they say the same words in the same tones and at the same speeds and pitch, they are different, and they have maybe I don't know, maybe they were in a car crash one time, maybe a friend died or whatever. These impact who and what they are and what they can bring to it. And to fight against that is inauthentic, anti-folk, and I just, at the end of the day, I don't think it makes for good story.
It's not good performance.
Yeah, really. It's bad performance. It doesn't work. And again, when I say it doesn't work, I don't mean like I'm going through some intellectual checklist. I mean, it doesn't work in terms of, it doesn't really fire up the listener. It doesn't really hit. It doesn't work. It doesn't become a part of the audience. And that's the beauty of folk culture and folk storytelling across the board. It works if it works, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. It's a bit like comedy in that respect. It doesn't matter how clever comedy is if nobody's laughing.
If you don't laugh.
Yeah. And it doesn't matter how much that shouldn't be correct, how much that shouldn't work. If it makes people laugh, it is successful comedy.
Yep.
And I love it because there are so many theorists and thinkers who love to fight that, but they can't ever get away from the fact if comedy makes you laugh, it's successful. If comedy doesn't make you laugh, it's unsuccessful. End of conversation. There's really that's it. That's it. And I do love it because they want that not to be true.
Yeah.
But
I think you need to to be like good and honest as a performer. That needs to be your starting point, really.
It's got to work. You need the correct response. Whether it's, I think that I fervently believe that you should be different. When you've heard a story, you are the person who has heard the story is a different person to the one who was listening to the story, and they in turn were a different person to the one who was going to hear the story. The story has to change you somehow. Not in a big explicit way necessarily, but it does change you.
Yeah.
The spell, when it is cast, has bound you and altered you.
Yeah.
Which is really what stories are supposed to be. They're like, I often, when I talk about the nature of storytelling and what it's for, I talk about the fact that the parts of your brain that light up when you're hearing a story well told are the same parts of your brain that will light up if you are experiencing what is being described firsthand. And as a consequence of that, if you are told a story about some horrific lion and about someone getting mauled, you can then, it can give you the same instincts as if you'd actually experienced it yourself. And in some contexts, that can save your life. Yeah. That's amazing.
Learning from somebody else's mistakes.
A true story told well is quite literally a way of hacking into the mind and giving yourself a new set of instincts and lived experiences that you haven't ever actually had to. Yeah. It is truly magical in that respect. That is magic. I mean, that's magic. I would say, if you're talking about a definition of magic or a spell, which, as we know, is Old English for story, then using words and sounds and sometimes gestures to change the way that someone's brain works, to change the things they think, to change the things that they're reminded of, to change their very instincts. That's magic. That is magic. If I tell you, there's this great story. There's a particular story I used to demonstrate this, which is... it's about this dog, and it's a heartbreaking story. And when you've heard this story, there is no way, there's certain repeated phrases, certain repeated things. Yeah. There is no way, once you've heard this story, you will ever hear that phrase or say that phrase and not think of it. You will forever be trained now. Whenever someone says this, whenever you hear this, it will make you think of that, and then you will have an emotional response. Always. Just as if you see a big red stop sign, you stop. Yeah, it trains you. It teaches you. That's truly magical, and that's why I talk about this notion of enchantment and the importance of it. We must live lives that are more than just the intellect, more than intellectual, more than just the academy. Damn the academy.
So to go back to the story, you were saying Urith's true mother, birth mother. And we just said the pagans who are beating down the door trying to give the father lots of advice.
Yeah, if we're on the birth itself, the mother dying in childbirth is from the folk tradition. I didn't mention that earlier. That's one that's come from the folk tradition. Right. Yeah. But that makes sense. It's a story about a daughter, and the mother is explicitly dead, and there's the stepmother. Yeah. So it makes sense that people would have made that a death in childbirth. Which, again, in terms of this cyclical thing,
it gives it a lot of power, doesn't it? It's the mother dying in order to give life, and then the daughter dying in order to give life.
That element of the folk tradition is, again, something which really defines the Urith legend and really made me want to place it alongside in the podcast, alongside Sheaf and Shield. It really, to me, shrieks volumes about the nature of the story. Yeah. And again,
this is repairing the agricultural cycle.
Yeah. I would also say it's really important that we establish that to the viewers, the audience at home. Hello. Hello.
Sorry.
It's very important that we establish to the audience at home, to the viewers, to anyone who happens to be listening to us, of the many, many people, that we're not trying to reconstruct a version of the story from 1,000 years ago. That version of the story doesn't have any greater validity than a version of the story from 500 years ago or the version of the story today. The very fact that in telling the story, certain elements have developed organically means that those developed elements, they have importance. I would argue they have greater importance than the things that are originally in it. Because those are the things which people have instinctually added and contributed. They tell us, those are the indications of the place that story holds in the folk culture, or in just the culture.
In a sort of survival of the fittest way, they're also the ones that didn't fall out of use again.
And now we come back to what works in the folk tradition, and why that lovely democratizing chain of infinite links is so important. That we don't have the authorial version. We have this wilding and rewilding of the story, whereby it is taken by the people, by the folk, and it is turned to their end. So it is appropriate. The very fact that people have organically and instinctually made that the death of her mother be one of childbirth, and this is happening during the harvest itself, and that's pushing us in that direction.
Yeah, I I mean, it's a story element that works, and you can very much see why, because it gives it that charge.
And I would say it's more than so this idea of it being a story element that works, or rather this is an insight into the value of the story itself, rather than just being an element. I think this speaks to the deeper semiotic roots of what this story means to people. I mean, not meant, but means, and why this story exists. Precisely.
So we've got the death in childbirth there.
Yeah, the death in childbirth. I'm glad, because I'd forgotten that I didn't list that amongst the folk elements, but that is one.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
There's the death in childbirth. What happens after? What was after that? There's all the
growing up.
Urith growing up, Urith. Yeah, there's arguments.
The arrival of the stepmother.
So there's different arguments about how old Urith is. Well, I think I said she's more than 7 and 7.
Yeah.
So I was nice and vague about it.
There's this thing about the father like dragging his crop unwillingly from the earth, which I think is a lovely image. But is there a place that came from? Like this, it's interesting that his crop stays the same while the others dip.
In my telling of it, and this is, again, I think this is validated by the impulses in the folk tradition, the way this story is told. In my version of it, the father, yes, it happens to be that he's a Christian, but really what he's about is more this like this reforming zeal, doing things because they're sensible, not superstitious. So I like the idea that he's cutting off both good luck and bad luck, and he just is he's embracing a life of just like
reason.
Middle and reason. It means it's never actually that good, but you get to say, oh look, it's not that bad either. So it's insipid, it's dreary and bleak, and he's not.
That feels very modern.
Yes, it does feel very modern. He's not seducing or worshipping the earth. He's simply approaching it, exploiting it in an almost scientific sense. So it's never going to.
No magic ever happens.
No magic ever happens. So it's good and reliable, whatever. It's not very good. It's fine. It's enough to live on.
He's Mr. Banks.
He's Mr. Banks. He's Mr. Banks. And I so that's where that comes from. This idea that he's kind of also destroying the beauty and the glory that everyone else gets to enjoy by actively, constantly debunking and by refusing to. So he gets to live this fairly bland, middling life, and which means he doesn't ever get the dips. But the very fact he's prioritizing that security is actively destroying the magic for everyone else. So it's destroying the bounty that can be enjoyed by everyone else.
It's an archetype that we see quite a lot in stories about magic
and in life. I think and the horrible actual debunker who just wants to destroy and tear down things and stops people from enjoying, who wants to not just, it's very often for this straw man figure who we're describing,
the one that we've
completely made up. It's very often for these people, it's not just enough that they themselves live lives that don't involve that. They have to make sure other people don't believe in it. They have to tell people who do believe in it that they're stupid and wrong to believe in it. They have to make sure everyone knows that they don't believe in it, that they're too clever to believe in it, they're above it. It can't just be you do your thing and let them do theirs. It's got to, and it's nasty in that respect. And there's a deep hypocrisy to it. All that stuff, all of that is what was there in that, I think, 2 lines, where I refer to this thing of the land not wanting to give it up, but it's taken. Also, because this is a story where we're so much talking about the female element, this idea of him taking it, just this play on notion of consent and impropriety that felt appropriate. That felt
that abuse of Mother Earth.
That felt like an important thing to. That felt like it's something that was intrinsically a part of the story when you're leaning in that direction.
So there's also so then you've got the well, I guess the next thing is the stepmother. The arrival of the stepmother.
The arrival of the stepmother. Yes, that's the next thing, which again, justified in the folk tradition, but I kind of did do my own thing with that. I described I also wanted to use that as an opportunity to describe an Anglo-Saxon settler in contradistinction to what a Brythonic Celt of the time might have looked like, the things that would have been noticeable about her and which would have set her apart. I also wanted to describe her differently to the way I've described all the other women who are usually well, you can read the books or this is the episodes to find out how people are, how other women are described. I don't know.
Which are the big witches or little witches?
Great witches, little witches.
Yeah.
Single hair on the end of a single wart on a single nose.
But so the other thing I was interested in is, so we then move on from her. She's well, we've talked about her a bit.
I want her to be a really. I think she's a brilliant character. I really like her. And I
she's certainly
wanted that to be.
She's very seductive. Like she kind of,
but also not in like a femme fatale way. She's just like powerfully herself. That's she doesn't. And so again, this is not. I don't consider this to be me making up a character. She is powerfully herself because she is explicitly heathen in the original in all versions of the story. In spite of the fact that she is married to an explicitly Christian man and the stepmother to an explicitly Christian, very explicitly Christian stepdaughter. Yeah. So she is quite powerfully herself.
Converted.
Yeah. I think that we're seeing her empowered autonomy there. That's intrinsic to what she is.
To the situation.
So I just kind of recognized that element, which is in the story, and I just followed that through in expressing her character. And of course, that will be one of the things that attracted the sensible man who loses his sensibilities to her, because that's her defining. That's that in terms of the character as we're given it. That's the defining element of her character. Yeah. So this is how I often look at these sources, and you can think of it as like excavating, searching deep. It's so easy, and in fact, most would look at that and say, "Oh, look, there's no character given. All we know about her is that she's heathen." But of course, that's not true.
There's some decoding that you can do.
Yeah, exactly. You can look. Yeah,
like
exactly.
Release some information.
Yeah, and the information is that, and also that isn't. People often will think, oh, but that's not really in the story. I mean, you're justifying it. But no, but that is in the story. That's there. Yeah. That is there. And in the telling of the story, even if you just tell the bare bones, that is still there. Even though it doesn't intellectually come across, that's what's there.
It can be unpacked.
Her defining characteristic, the only thing we're told about her here, in the oldest, in like the Bare Bones of story then, is that she is a heathen. Yeah. But by being told that, it means that her character is defined in the stories we're given it by the fact she's a heathen. What that means is that her character is defined by the fact that she's a heathen, despite the fact her marrying a Christian and despite mothering a Christian child. That means that her defining characteristic is independence and autonomy and social empowerment. In spite of the fact she's married to, she's actively married into this family, she's retaining her identity. I think there's
kind of no way of
those are the defining characteristics of her as given in the original story, simply by saying she's a heathen. That's a good character. Like that's a really good three-dimensional character that we've got already. And so that's the character that I expressed in the telling of the story, because that's the character who's there. I think so often a lot of the time people don't see the value in this stuff is because they're not storytellers. They look at the bare bones and they don't see the flesh that could be on it. And they maybe they don't realize that they're not storytellers, and they're so stuck on this assumption that they are, that they think if there's nothing they can see, then there's nothing there at all. And maybe this is hubristic, maybe this is arrogance, but I think that often people say something doesn't exist simply because they can't see it, and they are invested in the idea that if they can't see it, no one can. There couldn't be anyone with skills that I don't possess.
Much like the father.
Much like the father, the sensible man. Yeah.
Next, we have the famine, and I think there's something quite interesting about the famine, because you don't really see why suddenly. Because it seems to be a famine from the gods. It seems to be a supernatural famine. Yeah.
Which seems to be like the stronger Urith grows, the weaker the land grows.
Yes. Yeah. The other thing was the name Urith. The way you told it seems to come somehow from, like, he thinks he heard his wife mention it, but Maybe it was. Not sure.
So well, that's probably because we don't know where that name comes from.
Yeah.
So that's another fun thing, right? When you have, instead of fixing the story, you can embrace the fact that you don't know. You can embrace the fact that we don't know where the name Urith comes from. So in the story, we don't know where the name Urith comes from. I mean, that doesn't seem that crazy, but if you just take that element, the thing we don't know, then the fact we don't know, it becomes an element of the story itself, and that helps give it distinction and makes it interesting. That becomes and then we start to interpret other things around the fact that we don't know where that name comes from.
Yeah,
and we don't. It's a weird. It kind of shouldn't be there. The name Urith is an obscure, strange name, and it's also quite an important one. As we spoke earlier about how the name Urith is an important, and the spread of the name as a given name is an important piece of evidence for the spread of the cult. So we know there is significance to the name, full stop.
Yeah.
Also, that she's often referred to as Saint Earth sometimes, ERTH. The name is turned into Saint Earth, which is really interesting, especially when you think about what the concept of the story is. So there is, even if it's a later folk etymological link, there has developed this direct connection between the name Urith and the earth itself.
Yeah.
So I lent into all of that because that's really powerful. I love that.
And then with the famine, you have the earth kind of becoming thinner as she becomes larger. Yeah,
and with that, it was the so sometimes it's drought, sometimes it's a famine, sometimes it's both. These are all things that in the folk traditions. So I kind of was broad and vague about it, covered all of them. Yeah, for me, it's because she is existing outside of the proper cycle. So the longer she exists outside of that, the more it's starving the cycle. The longer the cycle
like something is channeled into her, which should be going to the land.
Precisely.
And eventually it is returned to the land.
And this is a big part of this idea of the individual at the expense of the community. It's the self rather than the whole.
So I don't know if I'm going down the wrong route here, but it feels as if somebody should have transgressed to cause this thing to happen. Are we saying that it's the father?
I mean, seems to me, yeah.
I mean, I guess it's open to interpretation.
Yeah, it's open to interpretation, but it seems like the father has transgressed. That the father's
which is strange
active way of life is
he doesn't really
hostile.
suffer. Well, not until he loses his daughter.
Yeah.
But I suppose, that
he doesn't suffer. Well, this is the thing.
The gods are playing the long game here.
But also, just because he doesn't suffer from it, I mean, I think that's everyone else suffers from his choices. But that's not. I mean, that isn't.
It's the heathens who are.
It's funny.
Really
one of in England, amongst the Anglo-Saxon heathens, one of the great downfalls of the heathens is that they were actually not very hostile to Christians. They were pretty cool with people also being Christian if they wanted. Yeah. They weren't they actually weren't, from the evidence we've got, for the most part. Yeah. It was the Christians who were hostile to people being heathen.
For whereas, religion.
For when the heathen Anglo-Saxons are actually quite inclusive and accepting of other beliefs and faiths, and those other beliefs, Christianity, actively wants rid of the others, they're essentially just fostering their enemy and allowing their enemy to. So that really was one of the major things that led to the total Christianization of England. Was that the pagans just weren't hostile to the Christians' hostility to them. Bizarrely,
isn't there something in the translation of Christian doctrine at some point where it changes from worship no God before me to worship no God but me?
Oh, really?
I feel like I've read that somewhere. Right, but I think it's possibly like a translation thing. If you know more about that, maybe comment about it.
Well, that certainly would fit with the process of
but it seems like
Christianization.
A canny way of making your religion spread and stifle out other religions.
Yeah, I think so. And certainly with this idea of in the story, with this idea of his actions, he doesn't directly suffer on, but everyone else does.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of true. Mm-hmm. Generally speaking,
the people who transgress aren't the ones
who really suffer. It's society that suffers. Yeah. It's the community that suffers.
Not the billionaires.
No, it's
certainly not the billionaires.
Certainly not the billionaires. Yeah, so I think that's I mean that's all there, and I do think that for me the transgression of the father is it's hubris. But it's actually rejecting the knowledge of. So he's rejecting ancestral knowledge, and he's also rejecting the knowledge of the community, of the folk, of other people.
Yeah.
He's being, even though on one level it's about. So this is another thing. One thing we know from the original story, yes, we know he's Christian, but we also know that everyone else around him is heathen.
Yeah.
So there again, what we have is he is explicitly not. He is by being Christian.
Yeah.
He is explicitly not going with
he's the
what
odd one
everyone
out
else
in the
is.
situation.
He's the odd one out in the situation.
Yeah.
And obviously, I mean, one could say, look, well, I interpreted that in a positive, empowering way with stepmother, whereas in his example, I interpreted it in a negative, arrogant way.
Yeah.
Perhaps that's just my interpretation, but nevertheless, that is
another way of telling a story.
Yeah.
Maybe.
I mean, you could invert it. You could make it so that you could tell the story and have him as this empowered, autonomous person who's doing the right thing in spite of all the backwards, awful people.
Yeah.
And the stepmother is the arrogant person for going with what everyone else does rather than her husband.
I think there's a way of. You'd have to work at it to kind of make it all make sense. But I think there's a.
Well, I mean, there's a very obviously way. It's a telling, but I think it's a very. Oddly, see, I think if you go down that route, it just becomes basic propaganda. It just becomes a quite propagandistic. See, for me, I don't think that it would be a good, effective bit of propaganda, and it will be it will be a version of the story which can be used to aggrandize the Christian father and daughter, and to demonize everyone else. But the demonizing wouldn't just be the heathen, it would be that she doesn't obey her husband. It would be that you would then be demonizing the stepmother for being empowered. And interestingly, I think what you end up with then, not only is it not a very good story as a story rather than just as propaganda, but that isn't the version that the folk have held on to. That interpretation is not the one, even if that interpretation was the one which may have been told by the church in the 15th century, and it probably was, that is not the version that has remained in the hearts and minds of people in Chittlehampton. So that interpretation is not the one. This is the thing, even if that was, and it probably was, the 1,000+ years ago, that was probably the version that was being pushed. But this isn't, this project, this podcast, and any of the books, it's not about reconstructing the stories from 1,000 or more years ago. It's about seeing those stories as these ever-evolving points of continuity within the folk culture, and seeing what the folk culture of the 1,000 years between now, the 1,000+ years between now and that historical version, seeing what the wonderful machine of English culture, English folk culture in that millennium has done to the story. Yeah. How has that what has it brought us to? What has that process resulted in? And it's resulted in this version of the story. That's really what I'm interested in, is that version and this version as the same thing, as the continuity, and then telling a version of the story which shows all of that, which shows that continuity, retains all the elements from there, and retains all the elements from here, and all the elements that are left for all the in-between moments. Yeah. But which does not ignore everything that's happened since and just focus on reconstructing the past. I think
that's a very good sort of justification for the choices you made in your telling. I'm still interested in what a version would be like, which was very sort of traditional churchy.
No, I think it would be easy enough to do. It would be about a good faithful Christian man and his daughter, and he is seduced by an evil pagan incomer. A lot of evil pagans come and take the land, damn them, and he's just trying to do good by his daughter. He's seduced by this evil pagan woman, but his daughter won't be seduced by her evil pagan ways. She remains true and faithful to the one true God. And the time passes, and the stepmother begins to really despise her for this. So she knows that because she can't control her, she must destroy her, because nothing can challenge her evil hegemony. So the perfect opportunity comes around because there's this drought. So she can then go and convince all the other pagans around, oh, you know who's responsible for this, don't you? It's because we've let some bloody Christians in. It's these Christians. And you know what? The dad's all right. I've got him wrapped around my little finger. But it's that daughter. She is the worst.
The gods hate her.
She thinks she's better than all of us. Yeah. All she ever does. You should see the things she says about you. The way she looks down and nose at us. Who does she think she is? You build it.
Yeah.
And then you'd have this lovely big climactic scene where they pick up their scythes, they reap her, and then but
because of her good Christian generosity,
but also no more than that. You make it so that they demand that she relinquish God and become pagan.
But
she actively refuses, and so she just prays. And as she's praying, then they cut her head off. The head goes down. Water bursts forth.
You've got your storyboard.
Probably the water then drowns all the women around who've just killed her as well. There's divine justice.
Yeah.
That's probably. That's how you would tell the story, doing it like that.
Well, there you go.
There's 2 with the price of 1.
Free version for you. Yeah.
I mean, they're all free. So yeah.
What comes next?
So what was that? Well, that was the
famine.
The famine. That was the famine element, which is cool and interesting. And then I guess
we go to her little tour of all the miseries.
Yeah, her tour of the miseries, which is a classic trope.
Little rule of 3.
Yeah,
you go through 3 different things.
You've got to have 3. Got to have the rule of 3. And then we come to the actual sacrifice itself. Now the sacrifice bit's really interesting, and it's one of the things that attracted me to the story because it is explicitly giving us a glimpse of paganism, of Anglo-Saxon, British, English paganism. That's lovely. When these little glimpses of it, I've tried to, in this book and the books that will follow, I've tried to find all the stories that do give us some insight into that.
Yeah. So would this be a good point to start to bring in the music that we heard, the lyrics for this version of John Barleycorn?
Actually, it really would, and I'll tell you for why. Because
I think I know.
You might. Yeah. In the version of the story as I told it, I actually did incorporate the fact there are 9 of them surrounding her, and she looks them in turn. She turns eastward 3 times. Those are just like little subtle acknowledgements of the Aecerbot charm. The academic consensus, there's obviously lots of theories, is that Aecerbot is, as I said in the podcast, a Christianized version of a Anglo-Saxon pagan charm or ceremony, ritual, in order to give a good fertile field and make the crops grow really well. And it invokes Urca, Mother Urca, who seems to be an agricultural earth goddess, an earth mother goddess. In the version that we have that survives, written in Old English, it has been Christianized. There are references to doing different corners of the field to different saints. But this Urca thing is left in, and the entire tone and flavour of it is deeply pre-Christian. Real fertility god stuff, real Earth Mother stuff. There's various cognates in other surviving examples of Germanic paganism that we've got, Dawn Mother and so on, Dawn Mother stuff. It's really cool, and what some elements of the ritual that's laid out in Aecerbot, I just gave little nods to it in the telling of the Urith of the sacrifice itself. And as I said, we don't need to repeat everything from the podcast, but as I said in that, I translated key sections of Aecerbot directly into the lyrics for our version of John Barleycorn, which I was really happy with, and I think they're quite beautiful, if I do say so myself. And again, I'll just repeat it as we're on the music now. The particular tune for John Barleycorn is unique to Lyndhurst. It's a specifically Lyndhurst one. It was collected by Gardiner in 1904. I think it was 1904, maybe 1905 in Lyndhurst. And the translator of the lyrics and the coherer of the lyrics, I'm from Lyndhurst, and Zanny, the performer of the song, is also from Lyndhurst. So we did a real local. That's proper, lovely local folk
Very
culture.
concentrated.
There.
Yeah.
Really, really, really happy that. I mean, that sort of thing is rare these days. Certainly to be able to make work and make work well. I really enjoyed that, and much as with the. So obviously, John Barleycorn, in terms of just itself, was not. I do not believe that that John Barleycorn, the song, is a remnant of a pagan practice, pagan sacrifice. Even though that is a theory which has come about, I don't really hold to it. However, much as with the Sheaf and Shield song. The Anglo-Saxons retrofitted Sheaf and Shield to work with Noah. So I took a song about Noah and I retrofitted that to work with Sheaf and Shield. With this one, people have retrofitted John Barleycorn to be pagan. Right.
Yeah.
So I've taken John Barleycorn and so I've taken a pagan thing and retrofitted it with John Barleycorn. That again,
I've taken an association that already
precisely
exists. And
as I see it, that isn't me changing anything. That is part of this folk tradition that's already existed. The folk tradition has already made that association, made that connection. So I'm just picking that up and running with it. I'm moving it forward in that folk tradition. I think of all the songs actually in the series, that this one is the one I'm most excited by, the one that I'm happiest exists, and the one which I think most perfectly expresses our philosophy, our approach, what our project is for. And I don't mean necessarily that it's artistically the greatest accomplishment, or that it's the sounds the best, or it's the nicest, or I mean leave us a comment.
Yeah,
What do you think? What is your favorite?
Yeah.
But in terms of what's going on with it, the methodology that underpins it, it as an expression of our aims and our goals and our remit, our precepts, all of those things. I'm really happy that this obscure Lyndhurst tune is out. I'm also really happy that, in some ways, taking this ancient song, this ancient ritual, this ancient charm, and then giving it new life is really cool. I'm very, very, very happy with it.
Yeah, kind of hitching it on to John Barleycorn as well. It seems like there's something energetic happening.
Yeah, and it's
there.
not even. It's
combining it.
I would say it isn't hitching even.
So also your lyrics, they mention Skifa at one point.
They mention Skifa, which is cool.
We have the Allfather in there.
Yeah, so they actively so they reference these things. All wielder ever ruling, I think, is actually what's in there.
Yeah.
Now that probably
and then John Barleycorn, of course.
Of course. John Barleycorn in Aecerbot is referred to as Beowa, but I translated Beowa to Barleycorn because of the song. Because I kept Skifa as Skifa for obvious reasons, and all wielder ever ruling is what it's referred to. I left that. I think I left that unchanged. In the version that survives, that's probably intended to refer to the Christian God, but there's nothing about that that couldn't also then apply. It could equally be about Woden.
Yep.
All wielder, ever ruling.
Yeah. Great.
The all wielder. I love the old Anglo-Saxon terms for God, the Christian God.
Yeah.
All wielder, Glory Father, and Ghost King is my favorite.
Ghost King?
Ghost King.
Brilliant. I love it.
Ghost King. Yeah, Ghost King is an an Old English Anglo-Saxon term used to mean the Christian God, Ghost King. Glory Father is beautiful. I like Glory Father because Glory Father, again, seems to be such a close reference to All Father. And all wielder is great. The all ruler he's called, but all wielder wields all. I bloody love it. I really the beautiful poetry, and then I think that poetry that's innate to these. When I do translations of Old English poetry or charms, I'm hyper conscious of the poetry as being the most important element. And I actually go against common practice sometimes with this, in that firstly I don't prioritize the literal meaning. I don't prioritize conveying the literal meaning as being the highest object. I quite often think that I am perfectly fine with the literal meaning being there, but being quite obscure, almost esoteric, hard to reach.
Because poetry is that. When people do translations, they can end up killing a metaphor by just explaining.
All willed ever ruling would just be God everlasting. You would translate that to God everlasting.
It takes out
which is
takes
horrible.
Out the color,
what a bland horror! Like that's awful. All wielder ever ruling, acres waxing and widening, increasing and engorging, is beautiful. But God Almighty's fields, growing healthily in abundance, is not very nice.
Bland,
bland, very bland. Whereas this beautiful richness, this poetry. So often the translations of Old English poetry, I mean all translation, there is not a single translator of Old English poetry who I think succeeds. Please do comment and recommend some, but of all...
Prove him wrong.
Prove me wrong. Of all the ones I've read, literally no translations of Old English poetry are successful. Frankly, I don't think any translation of Old English poetry work as poetry. I mean, obviously, it's maybe a bit much to ask people to learn Old English just so they can enjoy the poetry. Yeah. But in its original, heartbreakingly beautiful. So the corpus of Old English poetry is overwhelmingly beautiful. Obviously, I mean, The Wanderer and The Ruin are both kind of like life-changingly brilliant. If you get them at the right time in life, then they'll change the path that you're walking down. They are phenomenal. I hope one day to release a collection of translated Old English poetry, but it's so much about context. Like I wouldn't just want to release. I wouldn't consider the translation I've done for this song of Aecerbot into Barleycorn. Partly because I've only done sections of it, but I wouldn't consider that a poetic translation of it yet. I mean, I could do the whole one, but I think you'd lose some of it. I would say this is more of a new work of art built from the earlier ones rather than a translation of that.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, I think it's not just the poetry. There isn't really old. I don't think there's, for example, Beowulf. I don't think there is a single successful translation of Beowulf. I know it's controversial, but I don't think there is.
Poetic translation, yeah.
Well, when I say successful, the poetry is... This is the thing, it's easy to forget that the poetry is important.
I was just thinking of, because we looked at the Tom Shippey. Last time, that's a prose translation, isn't it?
Well, he's not trying to... He's not trying to... But Beowulf is not just the plot, and Beowulf is not just the literal meaning. Beowulf, it is a poem, and the poem, it's frustrating. It's very frustrating. But we live in a very unpoetic age, a very deeply unpoetic age. But don't worry, folks, we can change it.
We're working on it.
We will rewild the culture with poetry and enchantment.
Great.
You, him, and me. We'll do it.
Do we have any more we want to say about...
Well, that's the sacrifice. So I suppose we got to the sacrifice element. It's interesting, isn't it, that a lot of the tropes, I mentioned that they're very similar to these other set stories. You see them in loads of others. Those are just the most obvious three. This idea of a head coming up and then landing and
a spring.
Yeah. Quite often also the headless body will then pick up the head. Sometimes we'll go to a church and pray and then die or something. That happens quite often. In fact, that is the depiction. We are both currently enjoying Alan Rickman's audiobook of Thomas Hardy's Return of the Native. And the pub in that is called The Quiet Lady. And the pub sign is a saint carrying her head. Could be related to Juthwara, in fact. Sherborne is in Dorset. And that's Juthwara's famous thing. So that could be related there. Other elements, obviously, we've got we've said it before, but the very fact that the sacrifice fixes the problem that the pagans had in the first place seems really significant.
Like for the pagans, job done.
Yeah, that seems really significant, and I think it's bizarre that hasn't been picked up on by any commentator or even really recognised by anyone engaging with this story before. That this is a story whereby the pagans would need to fix a drought by sacrificing someone, so they do, and it fixes the drought.
Yeah,
everything's fine. Like, that's great. They are successful. That's really interesting. That was, again, that's something about this story that really made me attracted to it. A strange, it's something that sets it apart from many others of similar stripe. What other elements are there? We've spoken about the fact it's women doing it, and how interesting that is in and of itself, and how well that works in combination with the previous story, which was of Sheaf and Shield, which engages with the same themes of cycle and sacrifice and agriculture, but from an explicitly masculine perspective. This being a perfect companion piece that does it in a female way, very interesting.
Yep.
And they use scythes. That's interesting. They use scythes.
Yeah.
The design of scythes haven't really changed. They're more or less the same type of instrument as they were then.
The fact of it being nine women who do the beheading. I mean, as you said, it's a reference to the
Aecerbot
ritual.
Yeah.
It was also reminding me of the 9 tribes that we were talking about, but I guess it's just to do with the magic number.
The magic number is 9, or sometimes 7. Weirdly, in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, 7
as well.
In Norse, it's pretty much 9, but in the Anglo-Saxon, in the Norse tradition, there are 9 worlds, but in the Anglo-Saxon, there's 7. And there's various other examples. 9 still appears as a significant number, but 7 does as well. 3, 7, and 9 are the significant numbers in the Anglo-Saxon cosmology. And I find 13 crops up a lot as well. People don't tend to emphasize the 13, but I always try. Whenever I see a 13, I make a point of saying, "Yep, there's this 13 here." I don't add 13s in.
Every time you see a 13, there's a 13.
There's a 13. Well, I do it 13 times, and then I have a break.
Great.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything else about the sacrifice other than the image of a girl's head being lopped off by a scythe. That's very striking, like really striking. Yeah. So striking, in fact, I don't know why I'm not thinking of an obvious example of this in folk horror where someone's head is removed with a scythe. That seems so obvious. Surely that we must see, but I can't think of one.
I'm sure
there's an episode of Midsummer Murders where Orlando Bloom stabs someone with a pitchfork. But
that's different.
That's different. Yes, cultural implement.
Yeah.
But an actual beheading with a scythe recurs in saint stories, and it seems so obvious that. But I can't think off the top of my head. Leave a comment. Tell us of the folk horror movie or television series. What as that thing in it? I feel
sure I've seen it. I've seen that happen on screen.
Was it on screen, or were you just? Did you see it? No, like in a.
Oh, in the real world.
In a field somewhere. Did you see? Are you just
one or the other?
One or the other.
But yeah, if you do leave a comment, if you.
It's so obvious. It seems like but regardless, there's no other element of the sacrifice itself. The aftermath of the sacrifice, this spring we've established, very complex. There, you can go to.
It does. That seems like a justification in itself. The presence of a spring, like
there's the spring.
It's the consequence. Yeah, I guess it does. It represents the return of the cycle of of agriculture.
I mentioned that Saint Urith is still there. Someone's called Saint Tyr as well, which is just a corruption. You can see that would happen. Saint Urith, Saint Ure, Saint Tyra, like you can see Saint Tyra, you can see how that would happen. And then Tidywell, which is could be a corruption of Saint Tyra, Saint Tidywell, Saint Turid, Saint Tiddy, or it could just be Tiddy is a slang for small, slang or provincialism for small,
Cole.
Like Tiddy Cole, precisely. So it could be either one. There's also some local traditions that maybe it isn't that well, maybe it's a different well.
Yeah.
I think there's at least 2 other wells that lay claim to that, but this one is the major one, and it's certainly the one which historically would have been considered the well. I think there's one that's much harder to get to and more out of the way that that certainly some of the local people I spoke to prefer, just because it's less known about, it's more obscure, and that's obviously fun.
So this episode brings us to the end of what we've started to see as the first quad episodes.
Yeah. Are we here?
Yeah. Do you want to say any more about this?
Well,
quad?
I think they're really interesting. I think one of my favorite things about this is that each of these stories is from a totally different type of source. We've got the first one. We've got chronicle history. And a chronicle history which is folkified and organically existed in an oral tradition for nearly 1,000 years, which is really cool. We've got the second one, which is a proper fairy tale, much younger, I'm sure, but again, it's existed in oral tradition. It's localized. It's an archetypal fairy tale in many ways. Then the third one, ancient Anglo-Saxon myth and legend, which has survived through Beowulf and various other things, and which is an ancient origin myth and an explanation of our people. That's really cool. Yeah. And then hagiography, a saint's life, an obscure saint tied to a specific small area who have kept that alive, again, in an oral tradition. Those are totally different.
Some serious range within 4 stories.
Chronicle history, folklore, what's the third one? Literal legend, ancient myth and legend, and hagiography, saint's life. All of them playing around with the same themes, interacting with similar and overlapping themes. All of them set at around the same time of year. All of them engaging with this seasonal thing. I think this seasonal element is really important. And each one of these stories, it's nice to be able to, just as the idea behind this podcast structure is that we're having different pathways into the same folk tradition by having the story and the history and a song and food and poetry. Lots of different pathways to engage with the same core. And I think that what we've got here is lots of different folk tales which engage with that same core, which is the season. And using season and specific days, having the dinner parties we did on August the 2nd, because that's the day of Rufus's death. That's really cool. That's a way of engaging with that tradition in a way which we don't need to tell the story or even sing the songs. We don't even need to eat the right food. Just doing something which we acknowledge is in memory of that on that day every year. That's again, we're talking about conduits to myth and conduits to history, and that's one of those. I think that's a really important one. I love how well these work together, and I love how, I won't say it wasn't intentional. We did not intend this to be an agricultural quad. We had this vague idea that we would try and make things relatively appropriate at the time of year they were coming out. But we certainly didn't decide this would be a quad, and I didn't realize how perfectly paired Urith and Sheaf and Shield. I didn't realize that until we came to actually record these, and they're a perfect partner. It's weird how well they are matched together. And I also hadn't really clocked the connections Urith has to the Red King as well. And it really, just putting them in this context together, this notion of sacrifice and of red flowers in the Red King, and even of the cycle being repaired, because it's this, they've taken
the land
being healed. It's all there in all these, and
from wildly different sources.
Wildly different sources from different. So if we just look at the vague times these are, bearing in mind that all of these have remained somehow in an oral tradition by now, right? So the Sheaf and Shield one, the tradition of it changing only comes from about the last 100 years, more or less. Like once Beowulf was established and Tolkien was engaging with it, so it's a much more recent oral rewilding that's happened with that myth, but it still predates this podcast.
Yeah.
So if we look at that, we've got the first one, which is over 900 years old.
Yeah. That's the one with the firmest start date, isn't it?
Yeah. That one we know, that's 1100.
Yeah.
So we've got that one, 924 years old, that story. That's pretty cool. The second one is much older, and...
Wait, no, Sprackjack's the second one.
Oh, yeah, sorry. So Sprackjack, probably much younger. Yeah. I would say that's the story... in a recognizably in that form, the story is probably 200 or 300 years old.
Yeah.
And 300 is probably pushing it a bit. Probably more. It's probably 200 to 300 years old, let's say that. So we've got one that's over 900, one that's 200 to 300, one that's probably 1500 years old or more.
Yeah.
Right? And then one which, again, is over 1,000 years old.
Yeah. Distinctly older than Red King. Yeah.
Isn't that crazy, really, when you look at how old those stories... And those... I mean, I hadn't really just thought of it like that, but we've just given... Those are some very old stories, but they are engaging.
They have something in common between them.
And the fact they survive. The fact that they might be obscure to many of you, but there are places where they're not obscure. Urith is not obscure in Chittlehampton. Rufus is not obscure in the New Forest. Sheaf and Shield is not obscure to anyone interested in Anglo-Saxon culture. Or Beowulf. Sprackjack, again, is not obscure to anyone who is familiar with fairy tales and fairy lore and motifs. But people don't connect this stuff. And I think that, as we've spoken about, emphasizing the breadth and diversity of the English tradition specifically really allows you to see how all these disparate tales from very different sources, from very different times, when you put them next to each other, you can see that they clearly and cohesively come from the same cultural framework. They come from the same place, and that cultural framework, that place, is England and English. When we just have, if we did 13 episodes, right, and we just did the thing where we said, okay, well, let's get one from the north of England, one from the southwest, one from the southeast, one from the Midlands, let's get one from the Highlands of Scotland, one from the Lowlands of Scotland. We'll get one from North Wales, one from South Wales, one from Northern Ireland, one from the Republic of Ireland. And then we'll do a Cornish one and a Manx one and a Christmas special. Well, on the face of it, that sounds like, oh, that's a really good thing to do. Yeah, that'll be a really good way of, like, everybody gets a story. Perfect. But what you get there is you're not given any indication of anything, because you think, okay, that's what Cornish stories are. That's what Manx stories are. That's what Northern Irish stories are. That's what Scottish, that's a Highland, that's Scottish stories. Oh, and then at most you think, oh, that's a story from North. That's a story from the southwest. You don't get to...
It fails to convey the range and diversity of any of those.
Any of those by actively trying to be inclusive in that way, they actually end up diminishing and almost exoticizing each of those cultural backgrounds that the stories stem from, because it's reducing them to just a footnote, really, to a passing nod. And I also, this is not a particularly controversial thing. There's no shortage of books, podcast collections that focus on the Scottish tradition, or even regions. It's easy enough to find Cumbrian stories or Northumberland folk stories. But acknowledging this English tradition in particular, which is engaging with itself and interacting with itself, is something which I don't think is being done in a way that I find satisfying. And I'm really happy with this quad, this first four, as kind of a proof of concept almost. Yeah, as
an introduction to that idea.
Yeah, an introduction to that idea, which I think has been successful. Disagree, if you will. Also do please agree, also. That'd be nice. But I think this has been really successful. I think that in this first four, we've seen just 4 stories. totally different places, but clearly coming from a cohesive culture.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm very happy with them.
I'd say join us as we move forward next into our kind
Halloween.
of Halloween All Souls quad.
That lovely quad. Yeah, so it's Halloween. So it's the whole cluster of that season. The Hallowmas season.
And after that, it'll be Yule, will it?
Then it'll be Yule. Yeah,
great.
Yeah, we're going to do like a Hallowmas quad and then a Yule 5. Really, rather, because we've got one of them is an explicitly Christmas special, and that makes our 13.
Nice.
Thank you for. I do really hope that you are enjoying these and that you're getting something from them, because I'm enjoying them. I think I'm finding our conversations very interesting. Do say as much, and really look forward to seeing you next time on Finding Folklore. Bye. Cheerio.